She was nowhere to be found, and her grandmother was dead. And in the corner of the room, half crumpled on the floor, sat a note that promised they'd never see her again. It was just past 6:30 p.m. on October 22nd, 2012, when Venkata Prasad Vena and his wife, Chenchalata, stepped into their apartment in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. The apartment, usually filled with the soft sounds of their 10-month-old daughter's voice and the comforting presence of her grandmother, felt unnaturally still. In the kitchen, 61-year-old Satyavati Vena lay motionless on the tile floor, face down with her sari soaked in dark red and her arms curled toward her face, as if she had tried to shield herself. But this wasn't a robbery, this was rage, and Sanvi was missing. Her bottles were still lined up on the counter, her toys were still on the living room floor, and her tiny pink shoes sat neatly by the door. But Sanvi was gone. Then they saw it, a white sheet of paper near the entrance, scribbled in broken English and spotted with what looked like a thumbprint. It was a ransom note, a threat, and a deadline. Shiva, your daughter has been kidnapped. Your emails and phones are being traced. If you want your daughter alive and safe, follow our instructions carefully. It's up to you, your 10-month-old daughter or 5 months of your income. In that moment, time collapsed. They had no idea who had done this, but the man responsible had already begun playing both sides. And what began with a note would lead to the first Indian ever sentenced to death in the United States, a case built not just on evidence, but on betrayal that ran deep, and twists that no one saw coming. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. Back in February of 2007, Venkata Prasad Vena and his wife, Chenchalata, left their home in India in search of something bigger. They settled in the US with a shared dream, to build a quiet life, raise a family, and work hard. Both of them were software engineers, and like many in their field, they found opportunity in Pennsylvania. They moved into the marquee apartments in King of Prussia, a complex known for its peaceful environment and tight-knit community of Indian families. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like home. Neighbors hosted small gatherings on weekends. Mothers pushed strollers in the courtyard. Children played near the walkways, while grandmothers sat nearby, chatting in Telugu and sipping chai. By every measure, the Venas had built a life they were proud of. Then, on January 2nd, 2012, something beautiful happened. Sanvi was born. She was their miracle and their world. And from the moment she arrived, the apartment was filled with even more laughter, more joy, more purpose. But raising a baby while working full-time in a new country came with its own challenges. So in July 2012, just a few months after Sanvi's birth, Chenchalata's mother, Satyavati Vena, traveled from India on a visitor visa to help. She was 61, gentle and soft-spoken, the kind of grandmother who quietly blended into a household, helping where she could, never asking for anything in return. She cooked meals, she cleaned, but above all, she looked after Sanvi. Their little apartment, tucked inside a quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood, was stable, joyful, and deeply rooted in love. And for a while, everything seemed perfect. But just 3 months after Satyavati arrived, everything would change. Because in October of that same year, someone who had seen that piece from the outside, someone they trusted, was already planning to destroy it from within. It was a Monday, October 22nd, 2012. Just another quiet afternoon in the Vena household. Chenchalata had dropped her daughter off with her mother in the morning and left for work as usual. Sanvi had been a little fussy the night before, but otherwise healthy and cheerful. Satyavati, as always, was there to care for her, feed her, and keep her safe while her parents were at the office. The Venas had no reason to expect anything different when they returned home later that evening. But as they stepped inside their apartment just after 6:30 p.m., something immediately felt wrong. The lights were off, the apartment was quiet, too quiet. And when they called out, no one answered. They walked in further, expecting perhaps to find Sanvi asleep or Satyavati on the phone. But what they found instead shattered everything. Satyavati was unresponsive, and Sanvi was nowhere to be found. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. Nothing in the apartment looked ransacked or overturned, but something had happened, something terrible. Then they noticed a sheet of paper near the doorway. It was handwritten. The grammar was broken, the ink smudged. It was a ransom note. The writer demanded $50,000. They insisted the money be delivered by 8 p.m. They instructed Venkata to send his wife alone. No police, no tricks, no second chances. Your daughter has been kidnapped. If you report this to cops, her body will be cut into pieces. If you inform this to anyone, you will find your daughter's body parts thrown into your apartments. Your emails and phones are being traced. The tone was chilling, not just for its threat, but for its familiarity. Whoever wrote it knew the family. They knew their names, their schedule, the way they moved in and out of the apartment. They even knew what Venkata earned. And the most disturbing line of all came at the end. Remember, your baby is starving since morning. It meant that the person who took Sanvi had been watching, long before the family ever realized something was wrong. But there was no way they could handle this alone. So, despite the warning, they made the only decision any parent in their place would have made. They picked up the phone and called the police. The moment the police arrived, the note was photographed, bagged, and analyzed. There were about 10 of those notes in different places in the room. This wasn't a random crime, it was personal and time-sensitive. So law enforcement made a decision. They would follow the kidnapper's instructions, at least outwardly. They advised Venkata and Chenchalata not to panic, and not to change any plans. Then they set a sting in motion. The note had instructed that the money be dropped off at the apartment complex's sports area, a small, open space tucked between buildings where families often gathered. It was just a few steps from where Sanvi used to play on a blanket under her grandmother's watch. Now it was about to become the focal point of a high-stakes operation. That evening, under the glow of streetlights and the weight of unbearable silence, Chenchalata walked to the designated location with a bag full of cash in her hands. She was alone, as the note demanded. Or at least, that's how it appeared. What the kidnapper wouldn't have known, if he was watching, was that plainclothes officers had taken positions nearby. They blended in with the neighborhood, some sat in parked cars, others pretended to walk dogs or check their phones. Every possible angle was covered, and they waited. 8 p.m. came, then went. No one approached, no call, no movement, and no instructions. So they waited longer. By 8:30, Chenchalata was still sitting there, her eyes scanning the shadows, hoping someone would emerge and end the nightmare. By 9 o'clock, the officers had begun shifting in place, exchanging quiet glances, trying to mask their rising concern. Still, nothing, not a figure in the distance. Whoever had written the note, whoever had taken Sanvi, never showed up. And just like that, the hope of a clean exchange dissolved. This wasn't a straightforward ransom. This was something else. Something more calculated, more dangerous, and far more disturbing than anyone had first assumed. Because if it was truly about money, they would have come. So then the question became, what was it really about? And where was Sanvi? By the next morning, what began as a police investigation had turned into a community-wide emergency. Flyers were printed in batches, each one carrying Sanvi's photo, her age, and a desperate plea for information. Volunteers poured into the neighborhood, going door to door, asking questions, handing out posters, and taping them to every mailbox, storefront, and telephone pole in the area. It wasn't just local residents who responded. Professors from nearby universities, many of whom were part of the Indian American community, showed up without being asked. They brought flashlights, formed search groups, and helped coordinate maps of nearby trails, wooded areas, and open fields. People who had never spoken to each other were suddenly bonded by a single shared purpose, to find Sanvi. And through it all, neighbors continued arriving at the Vena apartment, not just with questions, but with food, blankets, and silent support. They sat with the family, prayed with them, and promised not to give up. One man stood out from the rest. His name is Raghunandan Yandamuri, an IT officer and engineer. He lived just 2 floors above the Venas in the same apartment complex. He and his wife had recently moved in and occasionally attended the same community events. To most, he was quiet, friendly, maybe a little reserved, but never alarming. When he heard what happened, he told officers he wanted to help. So he printed more than 200 missing child posters at his workplace and handed them out personally. He walked the halls of the building, tapping on doors and speaking with neighbors. He stopped by the Vena apartment to offer his condolences, saying how sorry he was, how shocked he felt. He even comforted Chenchalata, telling her he couldn't imagine what she was going through. October 23rd passed with no sign of Sanvi. By the 24th, hope was beginning to thin, but the search didn't stop. Volunteers still walked the grounds. Detectives were chasing every lead, analyzing phone data, canvassing nearby areas, and revisiting each resident of the apartment complex. But then, something shifted. That afternoon, staff at the apartment complex's fitness center reported something odd. A navy blue gym bag had been sitting near the front desk, left there for over a day. At first, no one thought much of it. People forgot things all the time. But this bag had been placed deliberately, not dropped, and no one had returned for it, so they called the police. Officers arrived quietly and sealed off the area. They placed the bag on the floor, put on gloves, and carefully unzipped it. Inside was the body of 10-month-old Sanvi Vena. The search was over, but the grief wasn't. News spread through the complex like a current, quiet at first, then rising with every text, every call, every gasp that echoed through the stairwells. People sobbed in hallways. Mothers held their children closer. Some couldn't even speak. The entire community had rallied to bring Sanvi home. But now she was home, and it was too late. The very apartment complex that had once felt safe and familiar now carried a weight no one could explain. Because someone had brought her back, and someone had placed her there, not in the woods, not far away, but just a few yards from where she had lived. So now the question changed again. Who had done this, and why? Had they come back? After finding the blue gym bag, detectives turned their attention to the building's surveillance cameras. They pulled footage from every available angle: hallways, lobbies, stairwells, the garage, and the gym entrance. It was a tedious process, and every minute had to be accounted for. So they watched, hour by hour, frame by frame. At first, there was nothing unusual. Residents entered and exited, some waved at the camera and some passed silently. Most looked hurried, juggling groceries, taking phone calls, walking dogs. But then, sometime after the abduction window, a figure appeared. A man was walking toward the gym, and in his right hand was a blue suitcase. He opened the gym door, disappeared from frame for several seconds, and then exited without the bag. No one had noticed him at the time, but now on camera there was no mistaking it. The timestamp lined up exactly with when the bag was believed to have been dropped. The officers froze the frame, they enhanced the image and printed it. Then they walked back to the Vena apartment. Venkata and Chenchulata took one look at the photo. They didn't need to zoom in, they didn't need to be told, they recognized him instantly. The man in the image wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the same man who had printed their missing posters, who had walked their halls, who had comforted them when they were breaking. His name is Raghunandan Yandamuri, and now everything began to fall apart. Raghunandan Yandamuri, known simply as Raghu to most, wasn't just another resident in the building. He had even held baby Sanvi in his arms at a birthday party just days before she vanished. To everyone, he was warm, helpful, and present. He comforted the grieving parents, looked them in the eye, and told them he was praying for their daughter's safe return. But behind closed doors, a different version of Raghu existed, one buried in secrets, shame, and spiraling consequences. At 28 years old, he had once been seen as a rising success, an IT professional who had immigrated from India, secured a job on a work visa, and settled into a stable life with his wife. But in recent months, his carefully constructed image had started to crack. He was drowning in gambling debt. Casinos became a second home, and his losses were mounting fast. By October, he had lost over $15,000. Creditors were calling, accounts were draining, and options were disappearing. So he started crafting a plan. One that involved fast money, minimal risk, and a victim he believed would never fight back. He wasn't targeting strangers. He was targeting people he knew, people who trusted him. The plan was simple in his mind. Abduct Sanvi, demand ransom, collect the cash, and vanish. But what he didn't plan for was resistance. What began as a calculated abduction turned into something else entirely. And while the community searched, while the police scrambled, while the parents wept, Raghu watched it all unfold and said nothing. At first, Raghu denied everything. But then came the still frame, the image of him and the suitcase that contained the baby everyone had been searching for. And that's when Raghu cracked, and then he was arrested.
The Vena family was struck by tragedy yesterday when the body of 10-month-old baby Sanvi was found. It is believed that the 10-month-old baby has been murdered. Now, news coming in that there was in fact a ransom note left by the kidnapper which led the police to the killer.
The interrogation lasted 17 hours. It began with resistance, but slowly his words unraveled. He waited until Venkata and Chenchulata had left for work. He knew the grandmother would be home alone with the baby. He expected it to go smoothly. "I didn't think she would fight back," he said. But she did. There was a confrontation, and the situation spun out of control. Raghu claimed it was all a mistake and that he never meant for anyone to get hurt. Satyavati Vena wasn't ready to let her granddaughter go, not to a stranger, not to a threat, not to anyone. She stood her ground. She fought with everything she had, even if it would cost her life. The detectives gave him a plastic knife to demonstration how the confrontation took place. And not only had he committed murder, he had also taken jewelry and other valuable items from the apartment. It was also at this point that he claimed he put the baby in the bag, just to make sure she stopped crying. The autopsy report later confirmed what detectives had feared. With the handkerchief stuffed inside her mouth and the towel wrapped tightly around her head, there was no way Sanvi could have breathed properly. The medical examiner ruled her death as suffocation. Her airway had been blocked. The trial of Raghunandan Yandamuri began in September 2014, nearly 2 years after Sanvi and Satyavati Vena had lost their lives.
How do you think the hearing went today, Mr. Yandamuri?
From the outset, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Community members who had once searched beside him now sat in silence. Many came, not just for justice, but for answers. Raghu surprised everyone by deciding to represent himself. He had no legal experience, no trial training, and no real strategy. But he stood in front of the jury and insisted he was innocent. He claimed that 2 unidentified men had entered the Vena apartment before him. He said they forced him to write the ransom note, that they were responsible for the deaths. But he never gave their names, he never described their faces, and he never explained why he kept helping police search after the crime, if he had been forced. The prosecution, meanwhile, presented the facts. Surveillance footage showed him walking with the blue suitcase. DNA evidence placed him in the apartment during the time of the murders. His fingerprints were found on the ransom note, and his own 17-hour confession played on video for the jury to hear. The courtroom listened in silence as Raghu's voice, sometimes calm, sometimes strained, walked detectives through every part of his plan. But perhaps the most emotional moment came not from Raghu, but from his mother. Padmavati Yandamuri flew in from India to testify on her son's behalf. She spoke through a translator, her voice trembling as she begged for mercy. "Please save my son somehow," she said. She spoke about his childhood, how he had once tried to take his own life at just 11 years old. She described a son who was quiet, intelligent, but emotionally unstable. The jury listened, they weighed her words, the confession, the evidence, and the contradictions. Then, after deliberating, they returned to the courtroom. They delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. The list was long and the evidence overwhelming, and the punishment was clear. Raghunandan Yandamuri had become the first Indian national in U.S. history to be sentenced to death. His execution was initially scheduled for 2018, but Pennsylvania's death penalty moratorium, signed by Governor Tom Wolf, put everything on hold. And so, year after year, Raghu remained where the system left him, on death row at SC Wines, Somerset, isolated, aging, and waiting. As of 2025, that's where he still is. Satyavati Vena had come to the United States on a visitor visa. She was only meant to stay a few months, just long enough to help her daughter adjust to motherhood. She had already booked a return flight to India for January 2013. She never made it back. Sanvi Vena, only 10 months old, would have turned 13 this year. She never got the chance to walk, to speak, to grow. Venkata and Chenchulata Vena never gave public interviews. They grieved in silence outside the spotlight. Because what could they say? They had lost both a mother and a daughter in the same day, and the man who had done it? He had smiled in their hallway during the search. He had printed their posters. He had hugged them and asked how he could help. And all of it, every moment, had been for money he never received. This case leaves behind more than just grief. It leaves questions. heavy ones. How do you ever see something like this coming? How do you stop someone who hides behind kindness? And after this, how do you trust again? What do you think? Could anything have prevented this? Would you have done something differently? Let's talk in the comments. Your thoughts matter. Someone else might be reading, learning, or healing from your words. And if this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and stay with us. There's more to uncover.